Hello, this is George from George's Music Blog, and today I'm talking about a few of my favourite electronic albums of 2025. I might have given this video a title like Best Albums of 2025, but I can't honestly say these are the best albums. I've probably spent a decent amount of time with around 30 or so new releases this year, electronic and many not electronic, and the ones on this video are just a handful of those that stood out and fit with the niche of this channel. I've added links for where you can find all of the releases mentioned in the description below. So with that bit out of the way, let's get into it. Okay, first up is Meteorites by James Shinra, a British producer also known as James Clark. He has released most of his music on Analogical Force, the label who seem to be carrying the torch for this kind of acidy, breaky, braindance sound. His 2018 album, Vital Heat, was excellent, and I highly recommend that as well, as is Meteorites, but for what it's worth, I slightly prefer Vital Heat, which I think just stands better on its own as an album, probably because Meteorites wasn't conceived as an album, but in fact is a collection of tracks that Shinra originally released through 2023 and 24. Some of them have been reworked and tweaked for this full-length release, which brings them all together. This is spacey, dreamy, progressive music, but very much designed to make you move as well. In fact, it is probably the perfect example of what brain dance, if that term means anything, should really sound like. Sometimes it kind of has zany connotations for me, slightly wacky connotations, but Meteorites is essentially cerebral dance music. Shinra is an absolute production whiz, and his tracks sound way more interesting than many more well-known producers I could mention. I don't know why he is not more well-known, to be honest. There's future garage, post-dubstep vibes on Blade, acid squelches and fat breaks on Finch, mutated electro on Controller. It is all here. It's kind of what I imagine Aphex might have sounded like to people in the 1990s. Well worth checking out. Okay, Barker, also known as Samuel Barker, I believe. Another British producer, but he is Berlin-based and got a lot of attention for his 2019 album, Utility, which was excellent. Ambient techno, essentially, although not ambient techno in the kind of early 90s sense, which meant progressive techno, I suppose. This is more like ambient music with a techno pulse. Big room ambient is another phrase that gets bandied around. Think techno without the kick drums, essentially. His approach is very clean and polished and shiny, but also richly melodic and very lush. It is definitely not sterile music, but is very focused on mood. Sometimes for me, he's a little bit almost too restrained. I'd hesitate to say too pleasant as such, but almost just a little bit too clean. Sometimes I'm longing for a few more imperfections. He has done some excellent, more straight up techno. Well, not straight up exactly, still very progressive techno, but more dance floor orientated techno, in partnership with Andy Baumecker as Barker and Baumecker. So anyway, Stochastic Drift follows the format and aesthetic of Utility with 8 quite long form tracks. Track number 7, Fluid Dynamics, has more of a jazzy down tempo sort of vibe with the sound of live instruments, namely piano, brought much more to the foreground. Stochastic drift is a concept from probability theory and refers to the change in the average value of a random process over time. For example, thinking about something like stock markets or genetics. Pretty much all the track titles here are similarly weighty. So we've got things like difference and repetition, positive disintegration, and the remembering self. That last one, I believe, is a concept from Daniel Kahneman's work in behavioral psychology. To be honest, I haven't done the research to say exactly what drew Barker to each of these concepts, but it certainly gives the impression he considers his creative process in very scientific terms, and maybe that these pieces should be considered as the embodiment of mathematical, physical, or psychological processes playing out. All that aside, There is no denying that he is a master at creating a sense of space and dimension in his music. I know the album art features coloured geometric shapes, which probably influences my perceptions a little bit, but I just find it so tempting to visualize all these pieces as shifting geometric constructions composed of bright, clean lines and tessellating segments. It is ambient in the sense that it doesn't impinge on your ears too much, but it is certainly not background music. You could also describe it as easy listening, again, not in the sense of it being like middle of the road, but in the sense that there is rarely a time when I'm not in the mood for it. Very lush and very pleasing to the senses, and it's probably my most played album of the entire year. Okay, next up, Surgeon with his latest album, Shellwave. Surgeon is surely someone who needs no introduction whatsoever if you're into techno. An absolute stalwart of the UK techno scene, Anthony Child has been creating forward-thinking, uncompromising, at times brutal techno since the mid-1990s, with seminal albums on Trezor and his own Dynamic Tension label. It is hard to think of many other artists who've been so consistent and remained so respected and so close to the vanguard of techno and experimental electronic music for so long. So yeah, Anthony Child, legend. His latest album, As Surgeon, is pretty compact, and as far as I'm aware, he stripped down his creative setup, so it is just some modular synths and a delay effects unit, and he's just creating tracks by laying down the elements live in real time. The use of the delay unit in particular gives the music a very psychedelic dimension, with patterns looping over one another. There's also a bit of a dub-like feel with it, with the use of the delay. And indeed, Surgeon was apparently influenced by legendary music producer Joe Meek, who was known for his innovative experiments with reverb and overdubbing and techniques like that back in the early 60s. Plus, Surgeon's music does sit in a lineage that runs back to post-punk, dub, through industrial and experimental works of acts like Coil. Anyway, Shellwave is not an experimental release, but it is an excellent example of a master at work using a simple setup with a few simple tools to create very pure, very focused music that just does what it needs to do. It's uncompromising, it's banging, it's psychedelic, and yeah, it doesn't really get much better than that if you're into that sort of techno. Okay, next up is Alterations in Gyral Form by dgoHn. Not sure how I'm supposed to be pronouncing that, and to be honest, I've never really said it out loud before, but it's spelled dgoHn. Anyway, I think he's another British producer, or from the British Isles at least, and this is progressive jungle, I suppose you might call it. His 2020 album, Undesignated Proximate, was excellent. Lots of very nicely edited breaks. Excuse me, a bit of a jazzy vibe to it, but not in the typical way if you're thinking like Ronnie Size or Bookham or that sort of 90s liquid jungle, jazzy drum and bass kind of vibe. This is more like avant-garde jazz and has a bit of a colder feel to it. So yeah, Alterations in Gyral Form has a more experimental feel than straight up jungle drum and bass. A bit more of a brain dance vibe, but plenty of bangers on here still. The track Denzel's Breath in particular is an absolute banger if you like your chopped break beats. Overall, the record has a great mix of up-tempo cuts and more experimental downbeat tracks. I feel like dgoHn takes effort to draw samples from outside the usual sphere, so there aren't loads of amens or the other usual suspects all over the record. A lot more kind of left field jazzy breaks, but yeah, sliced and diced real nice. Okay, Ceephax with Slam Zone. Ceephax, real name Andy Jenkinson. I mean, obviously he is very well known within a certain niche, but I actually feel like now we are at the point where it's fair to say he's a little bit underrated. Ceephax has been at it since the late 90s. He has had dozens of albums and releases, and whenever I dip into his discography, I am just amazed how for someone so prolific, he's so consistent. Being the brother of Square Pusher, there's always going to be the temptation there for people to make a comparison, but to be honest, their styles have been pretty divergent since at least about 1999. That's probably the last time Most recent point, I can imagine a square pusher track that you might mistake for Ceephax or vice versa. He has been dogged in his adherence to a hardware setup, which you could argue, obviously, pigeonholes himself to a certain sound, but he just fucking does what he does. Acid, obviously, but he ventures into acid house, progressive house, disco, electro. There's even shades of Italo on Slam Zone. I haven't actually spent as much time with this album as I would have liked to this year, but it is just absolutely banging. He gets all his little square boxes synced up and popping along, and you've got to love that Ceephax sense of humour as well. So the cover art for Slam Zone is a mock-up of the Shoe Zone logo, which if you live in the UK, you will know as a budget chain of shoe shops. Don't know if they're actually still going. Anyway, that is just a kind of classic Ceephax sort of reference, that kind of lowbrow culture that he's not taking the piss out of as such, but just goes with the whole aesthetic of kind of taking hip hop and electro culture, but transplanting that from the streets of, say, New York or Bronx or whatever to a provincial British high street. Very unglamorous, very British. The track title is always good for a laugh as well. He actually hasn't gone too heavy on the puns on this one as usual, but Slamuel Beeps is a particular highlight for me. So yeah, excellent album if you like banging acid house with a bit of an Italo flavour. I have found it is impossible to put this on and not have a good time. It might not be the most forward-thinking or experimental music, but he is just fucking good at what he does, and it is great to see people still making music with this old school hardware. Black Moth Super Rainbow with Soft New Magic Dream. Now, I hesitated a little bit about including this on the list, but I guess it does count as electronic music. I've been waiting a long time for the return of Black Moth Super Rainbow, aka Thomas Feck, or his other solo alias that he goes by Tobacco. Now, despite being initially badged as a band, and indeed I was under the impression for some years that BMSR were a band, as far as I know, it is essentially Tom Feck's solo project. The last album released under this alias was 2018's Panic Blooms, and it was around then, 2017-18, that I got into this artist and ploughed through a lot of his discography. So yeah, I've been waiting a good few years, as have many fans I'm sure, for new BMSR material. If you know his sound, then there are no surprises really on Soft New Magic Dream. It is very synth heavy with his typically vocoded whispery vocals. That's partly why I hesitated about including it on this list, as he does essentially write songs in the standard, kind of rock pop structure, some of which are decidedly catchy. And it does get referred to as psychedelic rock, though I have heard an interview with Tom Feck where he heavily rejected that label to the point where it sounded like it irked him a little bit, instead seeing himself as having much more in common with acts like Boards of Canada than, say, Flaming Lips, even though BMSR did open for Flaming Lips, I believe, back in around 2009, and his songs do feature guitars frequently enough. But anyway, Soft New Magic Dream doesn't go in a new direction really, but perhaps just proves that he has perfected this sound. BMSR are the kind of act who are always going to have a small but dedicated fan base. There is just something about his sound and aesthetic that gets under people's skin. Certainly got under mine. And I guess it just gives people a fix or even a sense of comfort that they just can't get elsewhere. Comfort might be an odd word, as his music and certainly the visuals that accompany it, whether that's album art or music videos, are often creepy and unsettling in kind of quite a slimy, psychedelic sort of way. I've read his music described as liquid goth, which I like, and I'll chuck a few more words in there. Dayglow, Halloween, 80s B-movie schlock horror, but also weirdly kind of romantic and tender. I'd say there's little chance of Black Moth Super Rainbow finding mass appeal, just because his music is so weird, basically. I am sure there are tons of artists operating in a similar vein, but I don't think anyone manages to quite hit that weird sweet spot between psychedelia, vintage synths, and bedroom pop that no one knew existed, but so many of us apparently craved. Blawan, SickElixir. Now, this is probably one of the better known artists on this list, And to be honest, I have to make a confession. Having given it the big one, going on about Surgeon and UK techno, I had never really listened to Blawan much prior to SickElixir. I do remember when he started getting some attention around 2014 maybe, and I did check out a few of his tracks and certainly liked them, but it's just one of those things, too much music, too little time. So Blawan has been at the sharp end of forward-thinking techno for the best part of 15 years, with a long line of EPs that have refined his distinctive sound and particularly his idiosyncratic approach to rhythm. SickElixir was promoted as his debut album, despite the fact that he released a Blawan full-length in 2018, Wet Will Always Dry, not to mention an LP with Pariah as Karen. But they were both straight-up techno releases, and in his own words, he sees techno as too linear a genre for the full album format. Not a statement I actually agree with for what it's worth, but anyway. Whereas this is his fullest and truest account of himself as an artist and as a person. It is a dense, murky, claustrophobic, and at times unsettling record, most of the time in fact, and is born of some serious self-reflection, personal trauma, and ultimately redemption. Jamie Roberts took himself off the exhausting, hedonistic treadmill of being a professional DJ and has since got completely sober, which of course brings a new perspective. As he shared in a recent interview, he genuinely felt he was on a path to self-destruction if he continued as he was going. Given such a positive outcome, it might seem strange that SickElixir is such a harsh-sounding record, but I guess that is the sound of catharsis. And as Robert said in the same interview, loud and intense music doesn't have to be perceived as being angry or evil. To be honest, I don't have as much capacity for this kind of harsh, noisy music as I used to, but I'm glad I made time for this album this year. It certainly ain't techno in the normal sense. Blawan is operating pretty much in his own lane here. Over 14 tracks and less than 45 breathless minutes, Roberts tears through ideas in a series of nightmarish constructions. Demonic bass, demonic voices, and ungodly industrial percussion. It is a compelling sound, truly his own. Well worth checking out if you can find the headspace for it. Djrum, Under Tangled Silence. Now, much like Blawan, I expect this album is appearing on several more high-profile electronic lists of the year. The first full-length album by a British producer and DJ, Felix Manuel, in 7 years. And another artist who I feel like I'm a little bit late to the party to. Unfolding with the gentle tinkling of piano, much of Under Tangled Silence consists in the interplay between the rich, organic sounds of piano, flute, string, and percussion, and digitally generated glitches, chirps, and squawks, not to mention edited breakbeats. Not that there's ever a tension between the two elements, human and machine, as Djrum constantly weaves and plats, threading his unctuous piano notes around chopped breakbeats in a way that never feels forced, but rather intuitive and exploratory. The tracks build in intensity as the record progresses, with the tempo increasing and the beat becoming more and more complex until we reach the ultimate crescendo of Sycamore, where the music seems to fold over on itself and the track could almost be seen as like the entire album, but compacted into 11 super dense minutes. At times, Under Tangled Silence feels a little bit too aware, maybe, of its own artfulness, but the more I've listened to it, the more I've enjoyed it. As Manuel stated in an interview, he made a conscious effort with this record to create something that was both timeless and futuristic. So while it does traverse the spectrum of modern electronic genres, no track ever dwells too long on a sound that could pigeonhole it into a particular genre. A very impressive piece of thoughtful composition, and yeah, highly recommended if you like progressive electronic music, or dare I say it, intelligent dance music. So there you have it, 8 electronic albums I have really enjoyed this year and recommend to you. But what are your favourites? Please let me know. And of course, if you're still watching at this point, please give the video a like. It really does make a difference, as the channel is really small at this point. And please do check out my channel for more of the same. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.